Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us on today's webinar to explore the critical topic of net zero transition planning with a particular focus on the standard Flex 3030 entitled Net Zero Transition Plans Code of Practice, which is specifically aimed at SMEs. It's really good to see so many of you here today. So I'm Seb van Doord. I'm BSI's Director for Energy and Sustainability. Today's session has been designed for our BSI members, and the purpose of this session is really to bring together our community of members and to inform you about BSI's work in sustainability and the work that we're doing on standards, and hopefully to support you on your sustainability journey. Today's event is actually a follow-up event from one we ran last year, and it's looking more at the practical steps to help you with net zero transition planning, and it's based on feedback from members from the previous session and really looking at how we can help them. Obviously, since that last session in 2024, the global landscape for climate action has changed significantly. We've seen the re-election of President Donald Trump, which has ushered in a series of policy changes and reversals, unfortunately. Most notably, the US's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, as well as extensive rollbacks of environmental regulations. But against this backdrop, the role of SMEs becomes even more important. SMEs are the backbone of any economy, and here in the UK, they represent over 99% of all UK businesses. So they have the potential to drive change and to lead by example in the transition to a sustainable future. However, they often face unique challenges. As our net zero barometer, our annual survey for businesses to see how prepared they are for net zero, pointed out, SMEs often have limited resources and a lack of access to guidance on implementing effective climate strategies. So recognizing these specific SME hurdles, Flex 3030 was designed to focus specifically on SMEs and offer a practical framework for them to develop and maintain credible net zero transition plans. And it's tailored specifically to the needs and capacities of SMEs. So in today's webinar, we'll aim to equip you with the knowledge and tools necessary to navigate this complex landscape. And we delve into the practical applications of Flex 3030 and hopefully support you to take that all important next first step. Well, next slide, please. A little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so we welcome all your questions via the Q&A function, which hopefully we'll be able to answer in our webinar. Simply click the Q&A button in the side panel and post your question. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issues via the Q&A function. And we also provide a survey. Upon feedback of that survey, we will send you a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as associated links to relevant documents. This is a CPD recognized webinar, so please request your certificate via feedback survey following the webinar. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda. You'll be pleased to know that it's not just me speaking. So let me introduce our panel of experts that will able to support today's webinar. We've got Chloe Thiddy, who is the Policy and Engagement Lead at IEMA, which is the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment. They are the professional body for everyone working in sustainability, and she's dedicated to empowering climate sector professionals and enhancing environmental and social governance. Also, Chloe was on the BSI advisory group for Flex 3030. Later, we'll be hearing from Adam Bastock, who's the founder of Small 99, which is a small business that supports small businesses in building sustainability action plans. He has built toolkits and networks to help businesses engage their staff and generate ideas in action. Adam was also on the BSI advisory group for Flex 3030. Then we're going to hear from Ian Byrne and Sarah. Ian has an energy and carbon consultancy businesses and has led many of our key initiatives in the net zero space. He's also led the committee that wrote the standard that we're going to talk about, Flex 3030. And we're incredibly grateful for all of Ian's expertise and his role in developing Flex 3030, as well as all the other work that he's done. We also have Sarah Walton, who's BSI sector lead for sustainability. She works in the standards development area and looks at sustainability and climate-related issues. She's currently concentrating on circularity and net zero challenges and focusing on some key sectors, including clothing and textiles. And finally, we have James Hand of Geeky. He previously worked in asset management and co-founded the climate tech startup Geeky. He has deep expertise in sustainability and works with small businesses on sustainability. He's also been researching the content of lots of net zero plans and is going to give us some useful tips and common ways to start on your carbon reduction journey. Adam was on the BSI advisory group for Flex 3030. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of note on who we are as BSI. So as BSI, we are the UK's national standards body. In most countries, there's only one per country, and we're the UK's national representative. So we are the UK's national standards body. That means that we support UK government and industry with standardization needs and standards creation. However, we are both independent from government and from industry. We're a not-for-profit, or as we like to call it, a profit for purpose, meaning that we operate in the national interest, and any profits we generate will go back into the company to support with standardization needs. Our standards are developed via a market-led consensus-based process, meaning that all our standards will go out to public consultation. So any member of the public is able to feed back on the standards that we create. This consensus and consultation process provides the legitimacy and reputation of national standards. Standards are often voluntary and therefore capture best practice, and they build trust and provide assurance in what we're trying to do. Most often what we try and see, or what we see, is that our standards really help support on government policy, and particularly in the transition to net zero. In order to get from A to B, standards serve as a guide to help deliver on government policy outcomes. So I think that's it from me. Next slide, please. So I would like to welcome Chloe Fiddy from IEMA to talk about net zero. Chloe, can I ask you to turn your camera on there and hand over to you?
Hi, thank you very much. So yes, as introduced, I'm Chloe Fiddy. So I'm Policy and Engagement Lead at IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, where I look after everything to do with climate change and energy, and also mitigation and adaptation. And just as a note for people on the call, we are going to be rebranding. So we formally changed our name to the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals, and our sort of rebrand new name will be going out later on this year. So we will be known as ICEP. So anyway, I'm at IEMA/ICEP. I think before I launch into the presentation, we have a poll that we're going to run on where you are. Here we go. So the poll question, what do you think the future holds for net zero in your business in the next 2 years? If everybody on the call would be able to vote, this would be really helpful, because actually it's going to inform some of the things we're going to be talking about in a bit. Okay, so I think there's quite a lot of people on the call who haven't voted. We would appreciate any more votes to come in. Perhaps some of you, we didn't add a don't know option, so I appreciate that. Okay, I'm just going to make a note of that so I can refer back. Okay, lovely, great. So back to my slide. I think I'm going to be given control. Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, so I will launch into what I was going to be. Oh, gone too far. There we go. Okay, so the first thing I've been asked to sort of talk about is, what does net zero really mean? And it's quite an interesting question, and there are quite a lot of definitions around net zero. So the BSI definition is that it's about a sort of a timescale. So it's a condition in which, during a specified period of time, the greenhouse gas emissions of an organisation have been reduced as a result of greenhouse gas reduction or greenhouse gas removal enhancements, and if greater than zero, are then counterbalanced by offsetting. And then there are other, that's a sort of carbon neutral definition, and another definition for net zero is a condition in which organisational residual greenhouse gases are balanced by organisational removals over a specified period and within specified boundaries. Now, some organisations, you'll find a definition when you look at it online. Some definitions will say that carbon neutral just deals with carbon and not all greenhouse gases. Generally speaking, we're interested in statements that include all greenhouse gases, so the CO2 equivalent. But there are very subtle differences between carbon neutral and net zero, but for working purposes, there isn't really much difference. So if you're a small business, really the key is to look at your emissions and have a plan for reducing them to net zero. Now, I've just shared here in this slide the IEMA greenhouse gas management hierarchy, which talks about beginning with eliminating emissions and then reducing and then substituting and then really only finally compensating for those. And really what we're talking about is that getting to a state of net zero is going to be a combination of reduction and removal of emissions. But reduction is absolutely the focus. So really we would say at this point, probably in the general journey of an SME is not to spend too much time, money, energy on removals, and think about, if you're thinking about offsetting, really ask yourself, can you put your hand on your heart and say, actually, I've done everything I can to reduce, and now I'm going to have to offset this last bit. So offsetting, compensation, whatever you want to call it, is really the absolute last resort. And the reason for that is because greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for decades to hundreds of years, depending on what the gas is. And this is where the idea of carbon budgets come in. So in this principle, scientists have calculated pretty much exactly how much carbon or carbon equivalent we can keep emitting to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. And if we think about it as a budget, that's the budget we have available to spend or emit. And emissions are going up, and we don't have the scale of offsetting available to mitigate against them. So if we put it in monetary terms, we're using up our carbon budgets far too quickly, and we don't have enough removals capacity to balance the atmospheric books. And if you were a business and you were spending out more than you had plans to get money in, you'd know in what timescale you were going to be unsustainable and insolvent. And pretty much that's where we are globally with emissions. And I don't know how many of you follow Professor Sir Dieter Helm. So he's an Oxford economist and expert in energy policy. And one of his mantras is that which is unsustainable cannot be sustained. And I think that's a really good point. So we do have the IEMA greenhouse gas management hierarchy is fairly easily found online for anybody who's not an IEMA member but would like to sort of download it or review it in there later on after this webinar. Okay, so scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. What are they? Well, you're in the middle as the reporting company, and you start by reporting your directly owned emissions. So that could be energy burned in your facilities, such as, you might have gas ovens or boilers. That includes fugitive emissions, so such as from refrigerants or from air conditioning, and fuel consumed in your company vehicles. And that's what's called scope 1. It's pretty easy to calculate because you're talking about commodity products with a fixed set of ingredients. You've got invoices for all of those. Once you know what you've paid, how many units of your diesel, for instance, that you've consumed in your lorries or whatever. Once you know how many units you've consumed, you can go on the DEFRA website, get the conversion factors and work out your emissions. And as I said previously, all different greenhouse gases are made into an equivalent CO2e. So that's your scope 1. It's really easy. You've got the invoices and the conversion factors are free to guess. It's free to get from DEFRA. And then everything else is either an upstream activity, so pretty much everything you buy in to make your business happen. And then you've got downstream activities, and that's pretty much everything your business sells on to get your profits in, so you can keep going. And a lot of upstream and downstream purchases and sales are quite hard to measure in terms of CO2e. So for instance, you might buy a new widget making machine for your factory, or you might buy some chairs for your staff canteen. And the components of those are quite a lot more complex than the diesel you bought for your lorry. So that's scope 3 is quite complicated to measure, but there is one thing that you buy in to make your business happen, and that is electricity, which really functions very much like your scope 1 litre of diesel, or your refrigerant, or the gas you bought for your boilers. So that's kind of carved out. Again, there's a conversion factor. You've got the invoices, there's a conversion factor. So that's kind of a carved out bit of scope 3, and so that's called scope 2. But everything else is scope 3. So that hopefully explains why there are 3 scopes, how they're broken down. So looking at what's proportionate for SMEs to report. So there is a long list. So I've put here on this slide the greenhouse gas protocols list of emissions in different categories, and so they have broken them down into upstream scope 3 emissions and downstream scope 3 emissions. And there's absolutely loads there to report on. Quite daunting for organisations, and if an SME, it's probably quite especially difficult because you don't have the resources to throw at measuring all of this carbon while you're busy getting on with your day job of actually running your business. And then on the other hand, large organizations find it very difficult too, because the bigger the organization is, the more likely it is to have complex operations, and the more likely it is that there's a lot to look at. And so reporting is so far optional for organizations that don't meet particular size thresholds. So the Companies Act, Strategic Reports and Directors Reports Regulations 2013. So that requires quoted companies, large unquoted companies, and large limited liability partnerships to report greenhouse gas emissions in their directors' reports. But this is limited to, as a minimum, gas, electricity, and transport fuel. So this is going back to our scopes 1 and 2. They are welcome to report more, but not required to at the moment. And any company that is not in scope can report as well. And in fact, government encourages all companies to report. And then government set about thinking, well, how can we do 2 things? First of all, what we want to do is encourage all organisations to report, but also how can government wanted to be the leaders in the process and set a good path. So it started by publishing guidance for the public sector for procurement. So any company that wants to win a contract of over £5 million currently needs to comply with PPN 0621. So a contract, sorry, I should say a public sector contract needs to comply with PPN 0621. And this requires companies to report on scopes 1 and 2 that we've already covered, and some scope 3. And I've put little ticks next to the scope 3s that you would need to report on if you are going for a government contract that will be worth over £5 million. So the Cabinet Office team that designed PPN 0621 put a lot of thought into what would be achievable, but stretching enough to encourage companies to get going with it and actually think about things, but not too onerous, so that companies that weren't big enough wouldn't be able to compete for those government contracts. So they didn't want it to be something that would exclude SMEs from bidding for public contracts. And so this list has sort of become a bit of a default list for an SME that wants to get going with reporting on their scope 3, wants something kind of an achievable, startable list. And I think that has sort of rather achieved the Cabinet Office or the government's ambitions with this one. So those are the categories where you need to start looking at. And I know that other speakers are going to be talking about how you can get going with that. So I'm not going to talk any more about that except to say why. So the next bit of proportionate reporting for SMEs is the new procurement policy note, PPN 0124, which is the carbon reduction contract schedule. So this one goes a little bit further and says that government procurement contracts should have information on emissions associated with the contract itself. So what's the thing that you're selling to government? What are the emissions for that? And again, this could be a really good template. Even if you're not going for a government contract, you could adopt it for perhaps your main products or your main clients, and that might help set you apart from other organisations. And I've just included here the template for what the emissions report would look like and the emissions reduction plan. But if you need to know more, all the guidance on it, if you just Google PPN 0124, you'll find plenty of guidance online there. Okay, so moving on to insights from research. So last year, IEMA participated in the UK Net Zero Business Census Report. I've put a link. I don't know whether the link will work on your screens, but anyway, if you search up the UK Net Zero Business Census Report, you will find it. It's also available on the Business Climate Hub. And we've got a load of responses there. Now, I will just say there's a sort of slight caveat to where are companies on the net zero progress. As you can imagine, there is a degree of self-selection because, of course, a company that sees the survey, clicks on the survey, completes the survey about where they are on net zero is probably a company that's more likely to be somewhere on the journey than a company that sees a survey and says, oh, well, I'm not going to bother doing that. So it's probably not representative of the entire business community, but it's a good start, and over 2,000 responses. So looking at that, 73 said that net zero was a medium, high, or very high priority, and of that 73%, medium was 30, high was 28, and very high was 15. Looking at the 80% prioritising wider sustainability goals and 90% anticipating a positive impact on public perception and reputation. That's interesting. That shows that those groups are clearly looking at the market impacts and reputational risks of not acting. And then the 85% who are doing it because they're foreseeing benefits and meeting regulatory compliance, they are looking at, they're looking at the legal risks of and policy risks of not acting. So if we don't plan to do something about climate change, what are the risks of government changing policy? And then we'll find that our widgets or whatever it is we make aren't compliant with the new rules. So it's good to see that businesses are prioritising these things. We do have, there is some information there on the in the survey that you can find online, which looks at the barriers. And I'm not going to talk about the barriers too much because I know, again, that this is some of the things that will be coming up in the other presentations. But I would say that obviously as a professional body, we do recognise that the market is quite confusing around information and it is quite hard to know who to trust. So anybody who's an IEMA member has signed the Code of Professional Conduct for IEMA, and you would know that they're going to be giving you the right advice. But actually, to help people find somebody who can do the sort of reporting that they need, is that we are launching a professional register for carbon accountants and auditors. And that means that a company will be able to look up a registered carbon accountant, same way as you can look up a gas engineer and you can use it to check credentials. So this will be coming along the line. So, Chloe Fiddy sends you a marketing email and says she can do carbon accounting. Is it true? You'll be able to find out on the register. I won't, by the way, be doing that. But you'll be able to look people up on registers. So we know that obviously the price is an issue for carbon reporting, but hopefully with the register, you'll be able to compare quotes and service packages just for the same as you would for anything else. So anyway, just put that out there. That's coming later on this year. And then a little note on where we are with UK international political and economic headwinds. So everything changes so quickly where we are. It's a really fast moving space. I think, I've just put in 4 headlines here. We've got 2 headlines telling us that everything's going wrong. Our preparations for flooding and extreme weather are inadequate. The Bank of England is telling banks and insurers to fix the climate risk gaps. So we've got, a push on one side for action. And then on the other side, we have the fact that job losses in the States in the climate space because of policy changes there, and because of a change of mood at the White House, sustainable investing is no longer a thing that people want to do, or organizations want to do, or states want to do. And so there are fund outflows hitting record highs as people want to move their money into different assets. And just as an idea, I think I made this slide on Friday morning. And later on that day, Nigel Farage said that for councils that are run by Reform, anybody who's working on climate change or diversity, equality and inclusion needs to be seeking an alternative career, which really tells you everything you need to know. We've got huge opposition coming in from the far right in the States and in Europe and in the UK. And I think even more worryingly is the trend to a sort of more authoritarian sort of type of rule that might make future swings back harder to implement. And I think this is a real shame, because people who work in sustainability in local authorities are actually responsible for something like 66%, 67% of all of the initiatives that need to happen, whether that's helping SMEs with grants, helping SMEs with information, doing those walk to school things. That it's a very short-sighted thing. And then you might say that this is sort of one party that's recently had a big win at local elections, and what does that mean for central government? But actually, we're seeing really that the UK government has positioned the environment as being a barrier to growth. And we've seen that planning reforms are compounding fears that the natural environment will suffer in the quest for growth. And all of this is a real shame, because I think there's a great opportunity for government to embrace the benefits of green growth. So we've got some analysis from the CBI that says that the net zero sector grew faster than the rest of the UK, and that the jobs supported by net zero businesses were 38% more productive than the UK average. And certainly at IEMA, we're really clear that you can deliver housing and infrastructure and restore and enhance nature at the same time. And so the spring statement really didn't do much at all, in our view, to address policy and investment gaps in green skills and net zero and nature restoration and the circular economy. And so we're now awaiting the comprehensive spending review that's due in June, and a little trepidatious about that statement coming up. So overall, the headwinds are not positive. But as Seb said in the introduction, SMEs have a huge amount of power to actually do stuff and be influential. And so I will pass on to the next speaker, who will be able to help you take that forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much there, Chloe. Yeah, and ending on a not so high, but I think it's very important to reflect that. Really interesting. A couple of things. There's a few things I'm going to steal from you. One is Dieter Helm's quote on what is unsustainable cannot be sustained. So you'll be hearing me quote that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the ISEB rebrand. But thank you for putting it into the sort of current context, because I think that's always very important. I'll hand over there to Adam. As I said, Adam Bastock is the founder of Small 99, which is a small business that supports other small businesses in building sustainability action plans. Adam, are you happy for me to hand over to you there?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Seb. Thanks, Chloe, as well. I think that's actually a really good kind of setup in terms of the current climate and what's going on. And there's been a lot of discussion on my LinkedIn feed over the weekend of what this looks like in terms of the impact on small businesses and local communities. And I think there's a real narrative here which we can pick up on, which I'll come to shortly. I'm going to request access to take over the slides if possible. Oh, Well, so before we get into that, we've got a little bit of a quiz for you just to break the ice and to see what you're thinking of. So, a challenge for you or a test here is, which do you think has got the highest emissions? A weekly use of an electric car at 140 miles, gas heating over a week, or an avocado, or 1 kilo of avocados, which is equivalent to about 2 of them. So this is a bit of an icebreaker question just to get you thinking about emissions, and I'll come on to the reasons why in a second. While you're doing that, I'm going to look at the answers in the background, just to make sure I've got them. It's neck and neck between gas heating and avocados at the minute, which is always interesting. So the reason why I wanted to kind of ask some of these questions is that in my dealing with small businesses, there's a lot of context that's often missing around those emissions. And I think Chloe set up that scope language really clearly in terms of the technical requirements of that, but then trying to bring that into your local business and what does that look like? So I think the poll results there were that the avocado was the highest emissions. And yeah, just before I dive into the slides, I will, because I think the answers are actually further in. So we'll come to the answer shortly for that. If the tech team could put the vote quota into the chat, that would be great, just so I can see that. But yes, so I'll reveal those answers at the end. So you've got to stick with me and listen to me rambling at you for a few minutes before you get to have your the answers revealed. The reason why I started Small 99 is exactly that reason of the influence that small businesses have. 99% of the economy are small businesses. They're the backbone of the economy. They're the local communities, from your hairdressers to your pubs and cafes to industrial companies working and making widgets for people. That's really who is driving both the emissions in this country, but also who are driving the economy and are critical to us building those prosperous communities and companies that we need to be able to thrive. At Small 99, we've trained around 3,000 businesses since starting a couple of years ago, and through our digital tools and platforms, we've supported around 50,000. So we've spoken to a lot of businesses, and we understand the context they're sitting in quite well, especially around mentioning kind of how Chloe mentioned councils. So we do a lot of training and workshops, or at least we used to do a lot of training and workshops with councils engaging their local areas. But we've seen a real shift in that 2-year period around that. And so for us, it really was about how do we mobilize the masses? How do we mobilize those small businesses to actually take the lead on sustainability, to achieve that growth that they were looking for, and achieve that both the race to net zero in terms of the kind of the moral imperative of decarbonisation, but also how do we empower them to start preparing for what is coming? You know, you can fire all of the council flood mitigation people in your team if you don't particularly believe in climate change. That isn't going to stop the rain from happening, unfortunately, and those local areas are going to start flooding as well. So in terms of that political climate, I think there's a real challenge here of what we're seeing, and more on that shortly. In terms of how we do and run our workshops, we've had a lot of learning over the past 3 years, and we really try and make it fun. So there are 3 core principles that we run all of our training and workshops around, which is engagement. So how do we engage your team to have ownership over this journey and have that confidence in what they're doing? This is because of the issues that Chloe raised around scope 3 emissions and measurement, and it can feel quite overwhelming. There's a lot of information there for you to try and digest, and therefore you need to have the entire team on board with this. This can't just be something that is sat with your sustainability team or normally a passionate individual, because everything your organization does really adds up. We're seeing this exactly with a client we're working with at the minute, where about 60% of their emissions are purely in their commuting emissions, and therefore they need to influence their members of staff to come on that journey if they wish to meet their net zero targets and start decarbonising, because without them, they're not going to be able to achieve that, because so much of it is just isn't within their direct control necessarily. So by making it fun, by bringing people around a table, like you can see in this image, it really brings together that ability of people to own the actions they need to take to decarbonise, because this is a journey for everybody. It can't just be left to certain individuals. But to set the scene of why local community is really important to this, slightly frustratingly, but in a more fun way, the background to this is that the more successful thing that I've run and are known for is People Planet Pint and People Planet Pastry. These are local networking events, or not networking events, but meetup events that happen across not only in the UK, but now they are international. So we run approximately 80 of these events a month. They are in 15 countries. We've got 140 different cities or locations, everywhere from Haywards Heath through to Hawaii are hosting these events. And so we've got this community of 20,000 people. And so I just think to that point around reform and the implications we're seeing there is still a huge amount of people who are passionate, who are concerned, who are dedicated, who are worried about climate change, and most importantly, they're concerned about what it's going to do to their local community. And I think this is what we're seeing is that, yes, while there are a few shifts to the right from a very, what I would class as a vocal minority, I think there is a silent majority out there. The 89% of project highlights this. There's the 69% persuadables analysis as well that shows that at least 70% of people are concerned about climate change and the impact it's going to have on their community. I just don't think we're communicating it well enough. We're running these events all the time, and we've seen a lot of business owners come to these events to understand what does net zero really mean for them, what can they do locally, what are other people doing. So moving beyond the technical requirements where, yes, they might have a PPN 0621 policy, but is that really setting the fire underneath them to understand what they can do compared to things like, well, actually, if you're taking your kid to the local football field at the weekend and the pitch is flooded, that's probably going to have a much more tangible impact of a story of what you can do and how do you start preparing and mitigating against that flooding, rather than just having a decarbonisation plan. So I think this is the backdrop I wanted to set about where we've come from over the past few years, is that because People Planet Pint has been such a success, we've really changed a lot of our workshops and training, which was on decarbonisation and action plans and reduction plans, to become a lot more community orientated, to become a lot more hands-on and get people around the table, like you can see in those pictures there, to get people to speak to each other and go, what is happening in your local community? That is where the action is happening. That's where the movement is happening. That's where the motivation is in order for people to adapt and to start taking action on this. If it only resides in carbon accounting documentation, then unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see the progress that we need. So we are focusing much more on conversations and getting people engaged on this with that confidence to tell their stories than perhaps we were on the more technical carbon footprinting. And frankly, it is more fun as well. Not to denigrate anyone who does carbon accounting. So I asked you the question earlier of which of these has the highest emissions. The reason for this is because a lot of the training and workshops we've done over the past few years really highlighted to me that there's a lack of context and a lack of knowledge even within the industry, so even within sustainability professionals. And I'm hoping that the other hosts on this call or other presenters on this call have made a personal note of their answers here to be challenged as well. And a lot of people do get it wrong. So in terms of the order that people put this in, people said that it was neck and neck. So gas heating was at 46%, the avocado was at 46%, and then the electric car was at 8% in terms of the votes. So roughly people put avocado first, gas heating second, and then electric car third. Well, the answers are quite opposite. The avocado is by far the lowest emissions out of all of these at 2 kilos. An electric car is in the middle. So bearing in mind that electric car was the lowest voted here, electric car has 11 kilos, and gas heating is the highest at 70 kilos. So congratulations to those of you who chose gas heating. This is really the challenge that we've got, in that I imagine this webinar is also relatively self-selecting, and it's people who are interested in net zero who are here, and therefore this is the challenge we have, in that the emissions of everyday activities are still quite hidden within organizations. And this is the challenge is raising up the impact that people are having, because I think the challenge we have is, while people might be passionate to do something and people might be willing to do something, they may be focusing their effort and their energy, which is quite a limited resource, in the wrong places. If you're focusing all of your effort and energy on trying to get avocados off of the canteen menu while you've got a gas heating and people are driving in by a petrol car every day, actually, that's not going to be the best use of your time. So, and I use this word in the unofficial capacity, but this literacy of carbon, this carbon literacy element of getting people to understand where the impact is and where they can have that within their organizations. And this is really where, coming onto the Flex standard, and I think it is so important for this. So just to talk through some of the experiences we had. So I interviewed 3 organisations with the Flex to get their understandings and their inputs on this. And I think what was key to me is that we had 3 quite different responses from similar sized organisations. So just to paint a picture, SwimTrek, they are a travel company who do water-based holidays. Brett Nicholls Associates is an accountancy firm, and John Pass Jewellers are, unsurprisingly, a jewellery firm who've been running for quite a few decades now, and they've got 2 retail sites. So we've got a retail shop, a travel agency, and a kind of an accountancy firm or a professional services. So SwimTrek said, for those of you who might not be able to see the screen, we found that the BSI Flex 3030 takes a massive, uncomplicated subject and turns it into a straightforward process document that is practical to follow and implement. This is really key and really important, I think, in that a lot of businesses out there are looking for instructions effectively. They are overwhelmed, they are time poor, and they need to be told what to do, or would like to be told what to do. The level of need there is something I'll come on to, because I think this is where it gets interesting and varies, is that quite often that need is not always urgent. Some SMEs might not want to read, Brett Nicholls Associates said, some SMEs might not want to read such a document unless it is for something they are directly required to do. This may be where businesses and trusted advisors like BNA can provide support. And I think this is the key reality check from BNA, in that they are quite advanced on their journey. They've done their carbon footprint across all 3 scopes. They had a dedicated intern work for 6 months with them on building action plans that was part funded by Glasgow City Council. They're quite advanced on this journey, and yet they are struggling to get their own clients to pay attention to this. So again, to Chloe's point on the previous percentages on the report, I do think there is a challenge here in that there are the businesses that want to act are very passionate and very vocal about it. But again, we might be seeing that there's quite a lot of businesses that are doing as much as they need to, and that's as far as they're going with it. And with the rollback of what we're seeing from a policy point of view, that might be putting some of this ambition slightly under threat. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's very hard to make the moral imperative case to some businesses on this when they are struggling to survive. So if a business doesn't know if it's going to be here in 6 months, why do they need a plan for the next 6 years? That was the quote that I had from quite a few workshops that I've done, where people are just in that real crunch period. And therefore, net zero 2030 planning can be a little bit kind of deprioritized versus short-term gains. The irony or the challenge there is that sustainability piece is that often financial sustainability is one of the benefits you're going to see from taking action in the short term, and therefore be able to gain in the long term. Finally, John Pass Jewellers. They mentioned that measuring their carbon footprint has had a positive ripple effect across the organisation. There are several challenges that remain, however, in part around meeting their 25% reduction target. While they are making good progress on reductions due to a 2022 baseline reflecting some elements of the COVID lockdowns, they are no longer on target. And again, this is another practical issue that we found quite regularly, is that during kind of 2021, 2020, 2022, there was a lot of energy due to COP26 being hosted in the UK that put a lot of excitement and energy into the system for people to start measuring their carbon footprint and start on their journey, which had a very positive effect at the time of getting that going and slightly perhaps inflated the market. However, that then has died away, and people are now going back to their targets and going, we planned this in a time when we weren't taking any flights or driving anywhere. And now our business travel emissions and our commuting emissions are through the roof because we're having to compare against a baseline that was not normal activity. It was an exceptional circumstance. So I think this is the real challenge from a very pragmatic point of view that small businesses are facing on the ground, in that John Pass and the organisation there is completely committed to this. They will continue measuring their footprint year on year because they think it's the right thing to do, and they think it's both morally and commercially imperative. However, they do have some challenges around how they communicate that because, well, the reality is their emissions are going to go up, as it will do for most companies who are growing their headcount potentially, or are just sort of growing their awareness of this industry. The more you measure, the more you're going to find. So for me, that highlights the importance of the engagement piece as well, is that all the staff members do need to be on that. I'm just going to look to my other screen for some notes on what I wanted to mention. So I think there's a few key parts that we found in our experience over the past 3 years. And as mentioned, we've trained 3,000 businesses. That's mostly through councils or university funded sort of systems. Well, there's a lot of complexity, confusion, deprioritization, reprioritization. Businesses don't have much bandwidth at the minute for net zero or for the technical language of it. And therefore, my personal opinion is that in order to make this much more relatable, we need to be making it much smaller. And rather than perhaps talking about net zero, talking about the benefit that doing something related to net zero is going to have on their business in the next few months. We need to start doing sustainability by stealth, where it is what is the main benefit to the business of measuring perhaps their footprint on on scope 1 and 2, so that energy emissions, well, actually, it's probably going to be financial in that it's a financial efficiency audit rather than just purely a carbon footprinting exercise. And that's going to help identify wasted spend that might be able to drive costs down. That is the near-term benefit for it. And therefore, we need to be focusing on that and then educating them on the carbon benefit sides as a second piece and providing that framework once they're engaged and once you've hooked them in. But perhaps the net zero isn't going to be the first thing that they actually want to engage on with that. And would love to hear any kind of disagreements or questions on that in the Q&A as well. Happy to take those questions later. There was always a theme that we had, and I think this goes back to the people, planet, pint and people, planet, pastry analogy. We have a large audience of people who are very keen to do the right thing. The moral imperative here and trying to convince people that climate change is real is not the difficulty. 90% of people I engage with are pro action on climate change. In the time of me doing talks to those 3,000 people, I have had at most 2 climate denials or climate sort of skeptical people there. And typically they are just not convinced that it's greenhouse gas led, but they do agree that climate is changing, and therefore it doesn't really matter. They can still take adaptation actions whether they believe it's human induced or not. So this narrative that we need to educate everybody on climate change, I think, is a little bit misleading, and it takes too long. We need to be focusing much more on what are the benefits to your business of adapting to climate change and to decarbonisation, because most businesses already want to do that. But as we've just seen from that poll, there is perhaps a gap in the literacy of people knowing what is causing climate change, and that people may be focusing on avocados when they need to be focusing on heating. And I think leading on to that, this focus on measurement is perhaps one that I also disagree with, in that I think the carbon footprinting process can be quite arduous. It can be quite disruptive, it can be quite boring, and it can be quite dull. It is typically gathering a lot of data from organizations that may not necessarily be ready to have the intervention that's needed on that, because it can be a lot of data that is being requested of organizations that are otherwise time poor and already have quite a lot of priorities on the headspace. However, the key thing here is action. And again, therefore, how do we flip those actions into what are the benefits to the business of acting, so that they start doing that, and that measurement no longer becomes a requirement to start, at least. Typically, what I have found, as soon as people start acting, they want to start measuring, because they want to know the impact of the changes that they're making, and therefore they buy themselves into the measurement process by accident, rather than it needing to be the first blocker that they're actually encountering of going, well, before we start, we're going to need to spend a couple of months getting all your accounts data into the right format so we can start measuring. So I think that is that overwhelming piece of not everything has to be done at once. You can break it down into piecemeal tasks and keep that focus on progression over perfection. Having a perfectly valid PPNO 621 policy is great. However, if that is a barrier to you starting and taking your first steps, then frankly, personally, I don't care. Just get started, just start doing stuff. The actions are what is going to build a more resilient and more profitable business, not a focus on reporting. And therefore, if that is what is blocking you from starting, then don't worry too much about that. But going back to SwimTrek's point here, the Flex 3030 is a very pragmatic and approachable document, I think, that does allow you that process and that framework to progress into that once you're ready. But if you're more concerned about the avocados in your business and the gas heating, or you're concerned about gas heating, start working on that rather than trying to worry too much about the measurement of it. I think just my last point to Chloe's point as well is that as a small business, influence is your superpower. there might not be things that you can control directly, but you can influence a hell of a lot, both in your local community by going to an event and talking about the things you're doing, by talking to your staff about the things that you're doing and how they can help influence that, and by running workshops or engagement games, engagement pieces that might use games as a way to raise awareness and build those conversations within the organisation. On that note, I think I'm out of time, so I could keep rambling at you unless I'm stopped for several hours. So I will now ask to be the control to be taken away from me, and I'll hand over to the next person.
Brilliant. We'll take the controls away from you, Adam. Thank you very much. That was really insightful. Actually, a lot of that sort of resonated with me, in particular focusing on the ROI and benefits for businesses and making it smaller. I think the first step is more important than a perfect plan. The other thing that resonated with me was People, Planet, Pint and Pastry. I don't know why, but it grabbed my interest, and really interesting to see you've got a community of 20,000 members there. I'm looking forward to welcoming Ian and Sarah now. Ian Byrne is a principal at IBEX and has led many of our key initiatives in the net zero space. He's also led the work that ultimately resulted in Flex 3030. And Sarah Walton, I'd like to welcome her as well, as BSI's lead for circularity and net zero. Are you guys happy for me to hand over to you, Ian and Sarah?
Yep, let's go.
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Seb. Thanks very much. Well, hello, Ian.
Hello, Sarah, and I think we have a poll as well, don't we?
We do have a poll. So I think before you tell us, I mean, I don't know, do you want to tell us something about, I was going to say everyone on this call has actually been very much involved in the development of the Net Zero Flex 3030. They were all in the advisory group, and you were the technical author and the lead on that piece of work. And so it's very interesting to talk around what's needed for transitioning to net zero, but obviously we've wanted to talk a little bit more here about the guidance and the help that we've provided to small businesses around how you go about net zero transition plans. Did you want to say something first? Would you about BSI, the Flex itself, something about it, what it does, and then we can do a quick poll?
Okay, we'll take it that way. Effectively, the Flex is designed very much to give people practical steps to reduce their carbon footprint, to lead them through the process. I'm afraid it's a little bit in dry language, but that's the way these things are. But it's designed to spur action very much, and not just about reporting. And although it recognises that people may well wish to report on what they've done, that's seen as being secondary. Unfortunately, when we sort of scoped out the market first before we wrote anything, we spotted that there was a lot of things about how to report what you've done, but not so much telling people about what they actually have to do or how to approach doing what needs to be done. So that was the driving force behind the Flex. As far as the process goes of developing it, all I'll say is that I wrote a whole load of words, threw them at the advisory group, and they then made massive improvements.
Yes,
we hope they did. And we're on. The process works so that an initial version was released, I think, about last April. That was a deliberate. The Flexes deliberately keep their first one almost as like a final draft document. If anyone's familiar with the ISO process, it would be a bit like publishing a DIS rather than publishing a fully fledged standard. And then version 2 came out in December, which was the final version. And in fact, I was slightly sort of horrified to discover that version 2 has 50% more pages than version 1. But that was largely because there was a lot of feedback saying, this is great, but we'd like to see more practical examples. So I had great fun writing an extended practical example based around the Sunny Winds Hotel in the wholly fictional town of Wilmington-on-Sea.
Yes, indeed. And also there was, we were responding to feedback, and obviously it wasn't, the advisory group helped change things, but so did people like yourselves on this webinar. There was a lot of input from people who were using it and reading it. We had a lot of consultation on what was really going to be required, and so that expansion was also an expansion of layout and language and ways of organising that text, as well as adding more, as Ian says, in the way of examples and practical help. So before we go on, shall we move to that poll that we have for you you guys on the webinar to respond to? So the question is, what stage are you at with net zero planning? Not just started, gathering information, developing the plan, taking a few first steps, or on track? We'll wait for a few moments to let that settle, and then we'll... I think that's everybody. Oh, no, 75%. Wait a little bit longer.
I think it's interesting. We can see already, though, that the group tends to be split very much between people who are just starting, they're gathering information or thinking about it, and those who have gone a little way down the track, but not very many people feel they've gone all the way down.
No.
And I hope the wording of that last question doesn't imply that there's actually another group we should have been asking about who have said they're totally off track and are nowhere near delivering it. Because
no, we decided not to ask that question. We thought that people,
I doubt, to be honest, I doubt there's many on that.
No, I don't think there's many people on this call, particularly because this is, as we've said before, there's obviously an interest here in the people who've chosen to join this webinar today. Okay, so I think we're at 84%, so there might be a few more people thinking about voting, or there may be people who decided not to vote at all. But I think we can see a fairly clear sort of split, as you say, Ian. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of people have taken some steps, and they're in that gathering sort of stage at the moment of ideas and developing. Some people are well down the line to developing. What any thoughts? I'm not particularly surprised by any of that, or is this a reflection of the other people that you've been speaking to in your work?
Yeah, no, it's the sort of pattern I probably expect from people signing up to a webinar like this in the first place. If people felt that they were really on track and pushed down the road, there probably wouldn't be a great deal of need to join the webinar. So, but it's glad also that there's actually a significant number of people who haven't even started, because I think that's where we can hopefully give them a bit of enthusiasm to go. And as Adam has said, just take a few steps, just do something. Don't sort of be too overwhelmed by the process. It's not actually as difficult as it's sometimes made out to be.
No, and on that point, on the sort of the steps that people must take, would you say that in following the Flex itself, you might have to apply steps in any particular order to get?
Inevitably, any document puts them in an order, and I guess when we wrote it, we felt that was the order that would be perhaps the most common route to take. So you start off perhaps by measuring and then going on through the remaining steps, working through the document, but it doesn't have to be done in that order. If you say, well, actually, I really want to start with one or two concrete actions, to start sort of by attacking my heating system or banning avocados in the cafe, whatever it might be, then you can do that and in a sense then pick up the other bits as you go through. One reason for the order we had as well was that quite a lot of small companies are familiar with ISO 9001, sometimes ISO 14001, and so actually have a sort of a fairly common understanding of the sort of the almost like circular flow, sort of the plan, do, check, act, the deeming cycle, whatever you want to call it. And so although it's not a management system standard, and I stress that quite strongly, it's meant to be practical, it does actually follow a similar layout in design in the way that it takes you through the steps.
Well, actually, I'll skip to that, because in fact we did have a question about how you might, previous to the webinar from a participant, about how you incorporate climate change and sustainability requirements into a quality management system or a longer term environmental management system? And does the Flex follow a management system process? So you've kind of answered that, but that previous part of the question, how you've answered about the management system process, but previously sort of how you incorporate that, you would see presumably that that could be done relatively simply.
It's designed to be relatively simple, but as I said, using the Flex isn't predicated on having a management system standard. You don't have to have 9001 or anything like that in order to use the Flex. So it will fit into a management system if you've got one, but it's not necessary.
And yes, so you would recognise the stages. In fact, I think we've got a flow chart from the Flex itself that might be useful to show here. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Which sort of, if people are familiar with management system standards, I think, as I think you said to me, Ian, previous to this, you would see this. This would look very familiar to people looking at it.
It's very familiar. I think the one difference we've got at the bottom, and people probably can't see it on a lot of screens because it's quite small writing, is that little red sort of almost like secondary feedback at the bottom is on the reporting process. Reporting is optional. If you go down there also, though, we expect that as a result of your reporting, what you've said to other people, what you're talking to your fellow sort of companies in the same industry or in the same geographical region or whatever, may well then actually influence what you want to do next time round, because you'll pick up ideas from them, they'll pick up ideas from you. The whole idea is to try and keep this as collaborative as possible as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean, if I have to peer a little bit closely to read it on my screen, but others may be able to see it more clearly. But this flowchart is from the Flex 3030, which is obviously free to download and freely accessible to everybody. And I imagine many of the people on the call have already seen it and have had a chance to peruse it. So this will be hopefully familiar, or not come out of the blue. I wanted to just go back to, in fact, thinking about people on the webinar. We've had a number of questions from the participants beforehand that we thought would help shape our piece of this, our conversation here, Ian. So one of the questions I think that you will hopefully be able to offer some quite good insights on, given your role in writing a lot of the sort of greenhouse gas management works standards, or contributing to those over the years, is how to measure, how you might measure the carbon footprint of a product, for example. And I ask you that question because you're involved in the international standard on greenhouse gas management, on which is the 14068 is the number, but that's on greenhouse gas management for carbon neutrality. And a little bit of history for the audience before I let Ian speak is that used to be a PAS 2060, which was developed in the UK and has quite a lot of use as a base of a certifiable scheme, although I think the plan is now to withdraw that in favour of this new standard that you had a hand in working on and developing, Ian.
Yes, that's right. If I can try and unpack a couple of questions from that, I think the first one is, how do you go about measuring it? And I think Chloe was very clear at the start. You start off by measuring the most important things, and you start off by measuring the easiest things. Don't try and be comprehensive from day one. You're not going to succeed. Start off by looking at your direct emissions, your scope 1 emissions. Where are you burning coal? Where are you using oil, petrol, diesel, whatever? Maybe you're even using still using some coal, or maybe you've got a nice sort of log fire in some hospitality area that you're operating. So you start off looking at those, and you also look at your electricity consumption. And it's much more important to look at what electricity you're using rather than where it's coming from. Buying green electricity is a nice idea, but actually, at the end of the day, it tends to be a bit robbing Peter to pay Paul, because if you're buying a bit more green electricity, they're not generating any more specially for you. It just means that everyone else is buying slightly more brown electricity. So look at the consumption side, look at where you're using it, looking at your scope 1, scope 2s, and then also look at your indirect emissions, the so-called scope 3s. The PPN ones are quite useful. I have to say that with the SMEs that I work with, which tend to be at the smaller end of the scale, none of them ever actually could even dream of a 5 million contract with Her Majesty's government. So that tends to be outside their sort of frame of reference. But that the suggestion to look at particularly transportation, both in terms of transportation of people, perhaps if you're a consultancy or you're a business that's moving people around, or transportation of goods that you're buying and selling, is important. Because very often that's one where you can actually have a direct substitution between your own emissions and the indirect emissions, scope 3s. So for example, I might have a choice between using petrol or diesel in a company car or taking the train. Or I might have a choice between, I don't know, flying up to Edinburgh or taking the train to Edinburgh. And that's where there are actions that can be done by companies that do actually make a difference. It's sometimes a lot harder if one's actually buying in goods from a third party. The other thing to do also on the scope 3s is to keep a thought on so-called downstream emissions. These are the emissions that are attributable to the use of the products or services. So it's when you're designing an improved widget, try and think about, well, how do I design it so that my customers are going to use less energy, are going to be responsible for less greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Yeah. No. I think you've answered another question. Because not just the one about sort of how you measure individual, but the whole sort of carbon emissions question there. So I think that should hopefully have sort of been a good response for.
If I can just I'll just come back on one point that's worth also saying, is that when you're measuring things, you don't actually have some meter with carbon dioxide almost in the dial going sort of like that, showing how much CO2 is coming out of the tailpipe or whatever. It's almost always done through measuring how much fuel you're buying, so whether it's electricity from the bills, or whether it's diesel to the petrol pump, that probably isn't quite right, but diesel to the fuel pump, or whether it's gas that's piped into you. And then you can use conversion factors to convert them from, or so-called emission factors, to convert the amount of litres of fuel or cubic meters of gas or kilowatt hours of electricity or whatever the measurement unit is, to convert them into a carbon dioxide equivalent. They're freely available from DESNES, from the UK government. If you just search for the latest emission factors on DESNES, you will find the ones that are widely used and appropriate to use for almost all small enterprises in the UK.
Thank you. I think that's quite a good resource as well, sort of as a sort of real.
It comes as a spreadsheet, lots of tabs, lots of ones you can ignore, but lots of useful information hidden within them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we had. I don't know. I think we've probably answered the other question there about measuring carbon emissions as well. So I think that was quite comprehensive. But we had another question about how the flex might be used by a distributor if they were going to take it on and try to make it useful. Is there anything you would add? You would say that would make it specific for that?
I don't think there would be anything specific for that. This was one of the questions, as you say, that came in first, and I was trying to work out, and I think it might be looking also particularly at your transport emissions, as to whether you use your own fleet, whether you use a third-party fleet, whether you sort of put it out to sort of someone like Every or Royal Mail or FedEx or whoever they all are, and getting information back from them. It's a lot of the time, reducing emissions is actually good business sense as well, because if you are using a distribution network in the most effective means, you're actually probably going to be cutting costs at the same time as cutting emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we had a few questions around what the underlying principles might be for writing a net zero transition plan.
I think the first thing I'd say there is keep it fairly simple. It doesn't have to be massively complex. So to look at what you're trying to achieve, and I think you're trying to achieve net zero. When are we trying to achieve that? Well, it's probably not going to be this week or next week. It could well be 2040, it could be 2050. It could be a bit quicker depending on what business you're in. And then it's to make sure that it's not a document that sits in isolation, but it matches in with your general business plans. Maybe you've got a sort of a 5-year plan for the business. Think about how it's going to work with that, so that as you're continuing to develop your business at the same time, you're not just going to be piling on extra emissions, you're going to be improving your efficiency and reducing emissions at the same time. But to be honest, it's probably quite different depending on what type of industry you're in as to what sort of things you're going to be doing. But again, there's that focus that Chloe said right at the start about focusing first on reduction, reducing emissions, avoiding unnecessary emissions, and then actually looking after that at whether there's anything that needs to be done in terms of so-called removals, which are actually a lot harder to achieve, or looking also at the possibility for offsetting any residual emissions that you can't reduce, you can't eliminate. And the final element you might want to consider is to actually look at it not just about how we are doing our existing things, but are we going to have to adapt our business to the effects of climate change? In the fictional hotel example, it was questions like, well, actually, will this mean people want to stay more or less in an English seaside resort on holiday? Will the pattern of usage vary because of climate change? Do we also have to make sure that we might get worse storms in winter, and therefore we have to actually build that into any actions we're taking to improve the efficiency of buildings? There's a whole lot of questions, but as I said, it tends to vary a great deal from company to company.
So in the sort of writing of a plan, if you like, or setting out this plan and keeping it as simple as possible, I think one of the things that you mentioned, there's obviously in the Flex itself, but is that that piece that, in fact, just to refer back to the whole sort of ROI thing, is keeping your senior management on board, or getting buy-in from the start, from that sort of, or if you are top management, being sort of very much engaged in the process. Is there anything more?
That's right, and it's also important to keep the chap in charge of finance or lady in charge of finance, the finance director or whatever title they might have, on board, because there's no point creating a plan that says we're going to spend masses of money unless you can demonstrate that there's actually going to be savings involved. Probably plans will start off with lower cost measures. You'll probably need to think about maybe banding them as ones that we can do out of everyday expenditure. Ones that are going to involve capital expenditure may require going to the bank, talking to finance people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a bit about setting targets, I think, and what you might, what that means to people when they're looking at, thinking about using conversion factors to help themselves with that. There was a question about does the Flex offer recommendations, and this as to what I can do to reduce emissions, and I think we had some responses there, but we've already sort of covered off the fact that there were a lot of examples given. But I think you also had another point that you wanted to make here about making the plan will be specific for an organisation itself.
That's right. As I said, there are, particularly in the worked example of Max, some very specific examples that would relate to that sort of business. But if you are in a manufacturing business, we're well aware that it can be quite different, the sort of things you're going to have to do, or the order of things that you might want to do, because your pattern of energy use, your pattern of emissions is different. I should say that for most organizations, when looking at this, you'll find that the vast majority of GHG emissions that need to be addressed come from energy. Sometimes you will have sort of things like refrigerant gases that might be contributors, but a lot of the time it's simply just looking at where are we using energy, how can we use it more effectively, how can we update that.
Thank you. I think we've kind of reached a sort of a natural stopping point there, Ian, if that's okay. Sort of a quick roundup of some of the key points in the flex. So now I think we're going to hand over. Well, we hand back to Seb.
Yes, thank you, Sarah and Ian. Really interesting there. So some really good point. I think for me, your polling question was interesting to see where companies are on their net zero plans. I think for me, the interesting part, and I think you alluded to that, Ian, is for me, the first step is the best step, and this is a long-term transition, 2040, 2050 plans. The thing that jumped out for me, Ian, was the sort of pragmatism. Start by measuring the most impactful first, and do not try to be comprehensive right from the start. I think that could be sort of analysis through paralysis if you're trying to sort of measure everything. So that sounds really interesting. And maybe we can provide a link to some of the emission factors from DESNES. I personally can't wait for this to be to using AI for this and seeing if that sort of makes things easier. But that was great. Thank you very much. I'm keen to hand over to James from Geeky now, just to introduce James, co-founded the climate tech startup Geeky. He has deep expertise in sustainability and worked with small businesses on sustainability. He was also on the advisory group for Flex 3030. James, are you happy for me to hand over to you there?
That would be great. Yeah, thank you. And Sam, if we could start with the first slide, that would be great. So as a quick background on Geeky, we're a mission-led B Corp. I actually founded Geeky in 2017 with my wife, Jo, who previously worked at the Carbon Disclosure Project. We've been fortunate to be able to work with 150,000 people all around the world to think about the ways that they can take climate action, and in particular work with companies on how to engage their employees, and working with everyone from really large blue chip companies with 600,000 employees through to small businesses with 6. And really what's fascinating about that is the commonality of successes and the commonality of some of the challenges. And that's where I'd really like to start today with the poll question, to hear a little bit from you about where you find some of those challenges. So Sam, if we could put that up, thank you. So I'm really interested in hearing that what are the barriers getting in the way of you taking action at work that would help to make the business a bit more sustainable? And as they keep on coming in, and thank you to everyone that's voting. If you're putting in something else and you want to share in the chat too, I know myself and I'm sure other people on the call would love to hear from you. Great. Any final votes? Please just keep putting them in. But this is something that we see kind of very consistently, is this like combination of time, money, and where to begin. Those are sort of some of the 3 most common. There's something else often tends to be something quite specific about the business, which is why I'd be so interested to hear in the chat about what exactly those things are for them. You never know, there might be someone on the call who can help you out. So if I could go on to the next slide, Sam. I'm going to start by talking about Geeky's own kind of sustainability journey, what we've done in terms of emissions, and then talk about some work that we've done recently looking at what companies around the world are doing in terms of the action that they're taking. So we actually began calculating our emissions back in 2020, and we're always thinking about both the measurement side, but also the action on the back of it. Measurement is a useful first step for some, not all, but it's the action that we're all really trying to get to. And when we were measuring those emissions, there were three things that we felt worked really well and we were very happy about. The first one is when you go looking, you will be amazed how many great free tools are out there for you to use. And as a small business, we're a small business under 10 employees. That is so important to find super cost effective ways of doing things. We actually started back then with spreadsheets, but we don't need to anymore because there are so many good free tools available to people. So that worked well then, continues to work well today. The second thing was having a really specific goal about why we were starting. In our case, it was we wanted to find out what the top three things we could do were to reduce our emissions. So yes, measurement was a stepping stone, but towards something. And we found that having that single specific goal was really, really helpful to keep us on track. And the other thing that we did, and I'll share this on the next slide in a few minutes, we also mapped out the kind of whole sustainability ecosystem a little bit. Because when we began, we found that whether it was lots of acronyms, whether it was lots of companies doing things, it's kind of quite hard to sort of fathom everything that's going on. So we just put it all in one place to act as a great reference guide to us in the future. Then what about the challenges? Well, I think the key challenge we found is that sometimes we kept getting lost in the weeds, and the classic 80-20 rule was prevalent time and time again, that we just needed to get to a certain point and then no further at that point. We just didn't need to. It wasn't helping us. But where that is easier in hindsight than it is when you're planning it out. But it's just a kind of constant reminder to ourselves to not go kind of too far and get lost in the decimal places. And our other key lesson was just the importance of when you do it in your first year or your second year, just making sure you basically write up what you're doing. It feels painful at the time, but wow, it saves you a huge amount of time in the future. And then shifting on to the action side, what worked really well in terms of the action was basically knowing from the measurement what our hotspots were, because it was only in doing that that we could know where we could really kind of shift the needle. And I found Adam's example earlier of avocados and gas a really great example of that. That is one of the things that the hotspot will do, is it will tell you whether, as an organization, is it avocados or is it gas? If you're an avocado producer, it's probably the former. If you're a big factory, then probably the latter. But you've got to know, and that's a really nice place to start. From that came some of the surprises. Now we're a remote first organization, and so quite kind of different in terms of how our profile might look to many, but thinking about home working was one of the kind of key surprises to us in terms of where we should be focusing and thinking about the ways that we could help our colleagues kind of cut their energy bills at home. So the surprises were really nice to see because it wasn't always the obvious stuff. What also worked well was actually building some policies out as we did it. Now, I've used this very kind of key word here, practical policies. Policies can sometimes be long, torturous, and not used by many people. So we wanted to keep them super short and be focused on exactly what we do. And they've been a really good guiding light for us since we brought them into place. And the last one was the whole process has been very useful for reporting back to clients when we've been doing procurement, both in terms of telling people what we're doing, what our plan is, but also having the confidence sometimes to push back on some of the more onerous requirements that you might get from a large company as a small enterprise. We had one that asked us the report through kind of CDP, and we were able to say it's just not appropriate for a business of our size, but we have done this. So that was really useful. But the challenges we faced on the action side were really kind of twofold. One is, I mean, we are often a small, tiny customer of some of the organizations we're working with. It might not feel comfortable, but the reality is it doesn't matter how many letters we send them, they're not going to change. So what do you do in that situation? Well, basically you've got to think about either basically accepting it or switching. And the switching is good, and we did that, for example, in the case of the bank that we were banking with, because we didn't like the amount that they were lending to fossil fuel companies. But the harder one is actually the second one, where things just aren't in your control. We're a climate tech firm. We use a lot of kind of online sort of data centers, and we use some that aren't 100% green, and we'd love that they are, but they have the best features. So what you do in those situations can be really difficult. You can get more efficient, but there's sometimes you've got to go, right, I've taken that one as far as I can. I need to come back to that in a future year. So Sam, if I could have the next slide. So this is what I was mentioning, where we've just sort of mapped out the kind of the sustainability ecosystem for SMEs. And we did this because there's so much stuff out there. It sometimes feels like you're kind of bombarded with kind of information. And we just wanted to kind of keep a North Star of where we should be looking for things. So whether it was in the kind of the really useful knowledge resources that are out there, the ones that you can kind of that you can really trust. Some of the big sustainability initiatives that you might want to be part of, and then the reporting and the standards. And we just found that having this in our kind of back pocket just meant that when we did see something new happening, we could either pop it on or just not worry about it too much. So it was quite a useful guide for us to have in the background. And Sam, if I could have the next slide. So what about you as an organization? What are the kind of the key first steps to take? Now, I think one of the absolutely crucial things, and this has been mentioned a few times already today, is it is not to start actually by thinking too much about sustainability. Think about the things that a business in any political environment, in any economic environment, will care about. And that is going to be, what's the business case? What is the business case in terms of winning new business? What's the business case in terms of cutting costs? What's the business case in solving a problem that your business is currently focused on today? I'm sure a lot of people on this call, just like me, share a passion for sustainability and taking climate action. But if you want to persuade other people in the organization to come with you, framing it in this way just helps a lot better. I think it was also mentioned that awareness about climate change is actually really high now. You don't need to tell people the doom and gloom stories about everything that's going on, which is deeply, deeply problematic, but that's not what's going to drive change. What is going to drive change is having a sense of the business case. And then your role is very much about being aware that people don't want complexity, they don't want uncertainty, they want to know simple, consistent things that they can do. So starting there with a bit of a mindset shift, I think, is just as important as where you might start, whether that's through measurement or you're taking action. And now on the next slide, I just wanted to go through what are some of the most common actions that companies around the world are doing. So we've actually spent the last 18 months researching over 150 climate transition plans that have been written by companies all over the world and in all sorts of industries, from advertising through to cement manufacturers. And what we found by doing that is we've kind of researched and found over 3,500 different actions that companies are taking. Now, that actually reduces down to about sort of 500 unique actions, because many people are doing the same thing. And one of the things we would love over time is to help kind of people see all these actions and become, one of those important trusted sources for what companies are up to. But these are across all of those transition plans, all of those companies, all of those sectors. These are the 5 most common ones we've seen, and you'll see there's actually 6 on the slides. I've got a little bonus one as well. So the first one is people are thinking about what they can do in terms of making their own products more sustainable. That often covers packaging, it often covers the materials that are going into the product. And for some types of companies, it also includes the efficiency of that product when the end customer is using it. But a very common place for people to start with a focus there on how is that going to help customer loyalty, how is it going to help pricing. Then one of the next areas that people focus on is their own transport and logistics. Now that might be their own fleet, so transitioning to electric vehicles. It might be if they don't have a fleet, or they also use logistics providers, finding companies to work with who have also got a plan for transitioning the fleet to lower carbon ways and lower carbon modes of travel. Then there is obviously renewables, and renewables covers a number of areas. It does cover people thinking about their tariffs. For big companies, less appropriate here, thinking about sort of purchase PPAs, purchase power agreements, and for lots on site, what can they do to kind of add renewables to their own facilities to get sort of a good payback from that over time. Now, the one that we see of all of the 5, though, the most common is around basically getting lean, getting super energy efficient in particular. So time and time again, we see that it's a great one for companies as a whole. It's also a great one for individual teams within companies, and squarely in that money saving box. And then the final one of the top 5 is around waste. Now, typically waste is not the biggest part of many companies' carbon footprints, but at the same time, it is an area where you often do get good engagement. People don't like waste, and they get annoyed about the recycling. And so whilst it might not be the biggest carbon impact, it's a really good place to obviously have an impact, but also get people on board. Now, the only reason I've also added in there business travel and commuting is that for companies in the service sector, the sustainable products one isn't as relevant. So for companies in that area, they often find that business travel, commuting, which can include home working, those are the biggest ones for them. So thinking about ways that they can do everything from changing sort of flight timetables, virtual working, sustainable hotels, thinking about how often people come into the office through the commuting and how they do it. That's another kind of key area. And just like waste, a good place to engage large swathes of the workforce. In organizations, you are either going to be commuting or you're going to be working from home. So that's a really, really good place to kind of get people and sort of get them thinking about the things that they can do. And then the last thing I was asked to do is just sort of think about things that you can do today, this week, and this month. Well, I'd say today you've already done the first thing. You've attended a webinar and hopefully got some things out of it. But the other thing that you could do today, if you're feeling kind of enthusiastic after the call, is do check out the SME Climate Hub. It's a really good source of resources. Just if that task you have for yourself today is just to have a flick through and have a look around, I think that's a good, you'd have had a good day if those are attending this webinar and having a look on that website is what you've done. The second one is do test out some of these free tools. They often have free sign-ups. They don't take very long to get your head around, and if nothing else, you'll learn a little bit about carbon accounting as you do it. And then my last suggestion before handing back is for this month, talk to your sales people or your sales team if you've got one. And the reason I say that is that if you want to keep things squarely in the business case camp, talking to your sales team about how you can solve problems for them by taking some of these actions will give you some really clear issues, actions to get stuck into. And as also straight away, you'll be sharing with other people around your office rather than just being you doing it by yourself. Sometimes we hear so often from SMEs that it's a side of desk. So immediately making a kind of a collaborative thing rather than you kind of being in charge of everything and the weight that brings you. So with that, lovely to be here today, and I'll hand back to Seb.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. That was great. Yeah, a lot there to sort of take in. I really like that. I mean, a lot of that resonated with me. Firstly, the 80-20. I always think, the world isn't equal, so I always sort of challenge myself to think 80-20. There's some great books by an author on there called the 80-20 Principle, which is probably one of my favorite books. The other thing is, what is the business case? I think that's something that, I've worked for a number of SMEs, and I always felt that you should marry up the business case with sort of sustainability. And I love the mapping of the ecosystem there. I might circle back around in the Q&A on a specific question I've got for you there, actually. But we have got a little bit of time for a Q&A now, so about 15 to 20 minutes. So I was wondering if everyone can turn their camera on while I'll start my timer and start asking you guys some questions. I think it's also at this point where audience members can post their questions that hopefully we can go to the panel with. But I'll start with a sort of few sort of starter questions and have a little bit of a discussion about that. I think one of the things that I wanted to sort of establish, I think we are very well aware of net zero, and obviously there's been a lot of momentum, as Adam sort of said earlier. Chloe, there's sort of a question for you, and then I'll go around the table with that. But do you see if there's any misconceptions there about net zero at all? Anything that we should think about there?
I think there are some misconceptions coming at net zero from different sides. So I think from the climate, I don't want to say climate change deniers, because I don't think anyone's now denying that climate change is a real thing, but the people who are sort of saying that we shouldn't do anything about it, one of their big misconceptions there is that it's just too expensive to do anything about it. And I think that's really unfortunate. It's unhelpful, not necessarily true, depends on how they're slicing their maths in that way, but it's really not the case. And I think, this might be a slightly controversial thing to say, but I think from the climate change champions, there can be some sort of messaging that nothing needs to change, we can keep doing everything exactly the same and everything will sort of magically work. And I think that's a bit of a misconception too. I think some things, business practices and so on are going to have to adapt. People are going to have to adapt a little bit, Personally, I don't know whether we're all going to be able to keep flying because SAF is going to be this incredible thing to solve airline travel, or are we going to have to switch to trains, for instance, for international travel, that kind of thing. So I think there's unhelpful messaging from both sides.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting part there, which you mentioned Dieter Hellman, and I've been sort of in renewable energy and energy companies before. And interestingly, years and years ago, probably going back sort of a decade and a half, I think it was Dieter Hellman. I don't like to sort of hold people to account necessarily, but I think that he authored a report that renewables were going to be sort of too expensive, right? And that was sort of the common consensus. And actually, if you look at the price now, it's probably our cheapest form of electricity. So I think it's even some of the sort of long-term assumptions that we place do and can change sort of rapidly. So that's an interesting one there. I'm wondering if anyone else had any sort of thoughts on that at all, if they've seen any sort of misconceptions. Don't worry if not, but raise your hands. If Ian, I think you've come.
Yeah, can I come in? I think one of the misconceptions is that net zero is something that happens in 2040 or 2050. We have to start doing it now. I think it was Chloe mentioned carbon budgets globally. We have to get to a situation where you do as many of the straightforward, the easy things quickly, because actually they're going to be cost effective. You recognize not everything is, it's again a common misconception that the whole thing is going to pay for itself. And if it isn't at the moment, we can just wait a bit for technology to come and sort it out. It's probably not, but don't delay. Don't think it's something that can be just sort of kicked over and, into a subsequent administration.
Yeah, actually, there's an interesting sort of element there, and I think you sort of addressed it, and so did Adam. I think you took a really pragmatic view, which you always quite like, and Adam, you talked about sort of COP26 creating a lot of momentum. I think I sort of see two things which seems to be the extreme sort of opposite. One, those companies that were going to meet net zero by 2026 after COP26, and sort of said really ambitious targets and are going to be net zero, and the ones that are sort of saying it's a long distance sort of plan, and actually we don't have to worry about it until we get to 2050. And it seems to me that there is that pragmatic step of saying actually you can take the big steps now on that sort of longer term journey. And I think we sometimes forget that it's a longer term journey, or we're trying to meet it too quickly. I don't know if anyone has any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, if I can just jump in
Yeah,
quickly
please.
on that one. Sorry, I think just two things really. I think to Chloe's point as well, like the Stern review, which was released in 2006, was a really big sort of climate change analysis of the costs and risks of taking action, and that identified that it was going to be far cheaper from an economic level to act then than now, and that was 20 years ago, and yet we're still in this kind of conversation around the financials. And I think part of that is because we're not putting it into the short term, and like businesses are making decisions in short term windows, and that is frustrating and not correct. And to Ian's point around, a lot of that is big investment costs, which might take 5, 10, 20 years to pay back. So for me, it's really how do you address those issues and make sure that momentum that COP26 may have started, or like the target setting may have started, actually is translated into the short term financial benefits. And I think James's point of the sales team is so critical there of getting the business case in as early as possible to make sure that it's baked in, because I think everyone gets the theory but they don't believe it or act on it. They understand it, but that's very different to acting.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the business cases are starting to stack up. We talked about the £5 million for public procurement that Chloe sort of pointed out. Yes, that might be out of reach for SMEs now, but actually, if you're ambitious, it's not, right? So it's better to start now and start small, so that you sort of can integrate it into BAU. Really, that when you are able to sort of bid for those kinds of contracts, that you don't then have to try and figure it out. So I think there is a real sort of business case behind it now. Just want to ask you a question, Adam. You've obviously engaged with a lot of sort of small businesses. We've obviously talked about SMEs and limited resources. Have you got any sort of specific thoughts on how SMEs can have, look at carbon measurement and reduction in a meaningful way? Are there any sort of first steps that you would recommend?
Yeah, and I think James has done quite a good job as well on outlining a lot of the free tools that are out there, and there are quite a lot of quite good free tools that get you your hotspots, and some of mine's included on that list as a cheeky shout out. But I think there is this case of you don't need to be perfect to get started, and I think once you've got that report, it's about actually taking it to your team and start discussing it with everybody, because there might be some surprises in there. And from my experience, is typically when I run workshops, when we get a carbon footprint in that workshop, people will say, "Oh, that looks wrong," and that's a really powerful point to go. Well, that means that you probably know what right looks like, and that means there's a discussion you can start building around that. And in terms of learning and baking that into everyday conversations, it's really powerful. So the example of that was we put them through a free tool. They got a carbon footprint, and like transport emissions were about half of their footprint, and they just didn't understand that because they used quite a lot of energy in their building. But they had a huge amount of visitors arriving to their premises, because I think they were like a swimming pool facility, by diesel vans. So they had a lot of visitors arriving in very large sort of diesel vehicles for various reasons, which meant that was a big chunk of their emissions. And as soon as they realized that, they understood it, and they then started looking at EV charging installs and went on that journey. So I think it's not necessarily needing all of the technical answers straight away, just having a rough 80% ballpark figure to then investigate further, drill down on, and start conversations with is the key part. And I think starting the conversations is the main part of that.
Yeah, interesting. James, not sure if you have any sort of thoughts on that, or you talked about 80-20. Have you got any sort of recommendations on sort of what is the first step, but yeah, that 80-20, that I mean, I'm just a big fan of it, because there are sort of smaller actions that have a disproportionate impact, right? So actually you can start with the sort of big wins first, and then sort of work your way down.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's sort of step one, what are the hotspots, what are the big areas? And then I think Ian mentioned it. Step two is then what can I actually achieve and what's affordable right now? And if you start there, then that's a good place to go. And then just kind of more. And I think it's been mentioned a few times, but just always then putting it in the opportunity space, not in the problem sustainability space.
Yes, yes, and I like that as well, because sometimes it can be, particularly over the last few years, there was a lot of, negatives around the sort of impact of climate change and all of that, but actually there is a sort of positive element here. And, there is a big business case there, which I think, we can start moving into the more positive communication, really.
There is, and there's a difficult line to get here for everyone in sustainability, is that we can't pretend that like there's some sort of utopian future for free around the corner. But at the same time, that doesn't mean there aren't lots of opportunities right now for businesses to get on top of. And I think that sits sometimes uncomfortably with people in sustainability, because they want everyone to know how bad it is now, how bad it's going to be. But what you've got to think there is that actually going to help? And if not, basically just understand that people are aware, most people, and then crack on with the things that are going to make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's going to probably be even more important as we sort of look at the geopolitical climate and the focus on growth, and we can see that in a number of areas. We are repackaging sustainability in growth. Labour government talks a lot about clean growth. They have committed to decarbonising the electricity grid by 2030, so there are clear sort of policy steps behind it, but it's also packaged in clean green growth. So that is really, really interesting. I did say, James, that I was going to circle back to you. I really liked your slide which unpacked the ecosystem of all sustainability sort of work out there. There were a number of organisations, and I was happy to see BSI in there. I think there's something that we sort of, Sarah and I and the broader team, often think about is what more should we do as a sort of standards organisation? Because yes, we are the UK's national standards body. We publish standards. Some of those standards are obviously freely available. Is there anything that you want to see? And, a standard could be a management system, as we've sort of mentioned before, but it could also be a guide and explaining how to do things like Flex 3030. Is there more that you want to see from us as the national standards body in that space? And don't worry if there's not, because I know I'm putting you on the block here, but I thought I'd turn the tables on us, really.
I think the most important thing there is the fact that you made it free, so that someone can download it, have a look, get started. And I think that is a great sort of thing for many businesses to follow. It doesn't mean everything has to be free, it doesn't mean there's no profit in it, but letting people have that entry step like that, I thought that was really important.
Yes. Does anybody else have any sort of thoughts on that? Now's the time to put us on the block. Don't worry if not, but I thought I'll ask the question, really. Ian.
I'll just draw attention to another free resource, which this time is an ISO document, but it's largely funded through DESNES, the fact that you can download it for free. And that's a standard called BSI ISO 50005 on a stepwise approach to energy management systems. And I think that provides, particularly for SMEs in the manufacturing or processing space, a very good guidance on steps that they can take to reduce their energy, which is one of the very important parts, obviously, of carbon reductions as well.
Yeah, shout out to Sarah there. She led a lot of that work, and DESNES sort of sponsoring it. There's a good part for ISO 50005. It's aimed at SMEs, and once you go through the process, I believe you are compliant with ISO 50001. You probably know better than I do, Ian. But that was
you don't actually have to go all the way through the process either. It's designed to be a stepwise approach, so you can take it as, in a sense, a bit like 3030. You can take it as far as you want, or you can go all the way if you want, but you actually are doing useful things along the way to improve your energy efficiency, to improve your energy management system. So it's a good document, and it complements what we've been trying to do in 3030 very well.
Yes, and yes, talking about the return on investment and all of that, this looks at energy reduction, and sort of reducing costs for you there, which obviously is a sort of good step to take there. Question, Ian, you've been involved in a lot of initiatives. I think Net Zero Guidelines, if I'm not mistaken, and a number of sort of other sort of initiatives. Was there anything specifically that you feel Flex 3030 was designed to solve any particular problem compared to some of the others? Because obviously it has a sort of slight focus and was more iterative.
Yeah, a couple of things that we felt that were not being particularly well covered before. The first thing is a lot of documents say, as part of a process, whether it's for carbon neutrality or net zero, to go away and write a plan, but then don't give you a great deal of information other than go away and do it. I mean, and I say I'm guilty of that myself, because I was the convener for ISO 14068 Part 1 on carbon neutrality, and in there we ask people to go away and write a carbon neutrality management plan, and we give them just a few bullet points as to what should be in that plan. But in terms of additional guidance on detailed guidance, it was kind of missing. And so although the name might be very slightly different, in fact the content is pretty much identical. So what 3030 is doing is actually giving a bit more flesh on the bones, and particularly from the point of view for a smaller organization. And that sort of brings me to the second point, and that is that there was a lot about reporting for large organizations. There's the Transition Plan Task Force, which has done great work, but it's aimed at the big boys. It's aimed very much at consistent reporting. It doesn't really say that much about what you should do. And that's what 3030 is trying to help on as well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I think it's such an interesting statistic. And Adam, you sort of used it as well, as, a lot of this stuff is aimed at the sort of bigger corporates, and actually 99.5% of businesses in the UK are small businesses. And every time I sort of use that stat, I double check it, because every time I think it's wrong, and it is obviously correct. And so it is interesting that we aim at the large corporates who have the resources, but actually we probably, if we want to have impact, we probably should focus more on some of the smaller businesses. But I can see you nodding there. I don't know if you want to jump in there, or sorry, Ian.
Yeah, I was just going to come back actually and say, in that context as well, one of the misconceptions about net zero, the question you were asking Chloe at the start, is that somehow, because I'm a small business, because my individual consumption individual emissions aren't huge, somehow it doesn't matter. I don't have to do anything. That's not true. There are so many small businesses in the UK and globally that collectively we have a huge footprint, and we have huge influence. And I think someone earlier, I can't remember, I think it was Adam, probably mentioned, the superpower is being able to influence other people as well. So just because individually you might be from a small business, I'm from a small business, don't think that it's unimportant. There's nothing you can do. You can.
Great.
Yeah, totally. I think just to add to that as well, like if you look at the supply chains of large organizations where they're trying to decarbonize their supply chain as a corporate, typically the top 10% of their suppliers are where they're really focusing their efforts on. But there's this long tail that is just unknown to them in terms of the scale of footprint, because it's so large and so hidden. And that's what scares them to a certain extent, and why they're focusing on that the top of their the more quantifiable emissions. So I think there is this sort of very virtual web in my head that is the economy, in that sense of all those small businesses do make up those large company supply chains and do make up those interactions. And I think it's just, as you walk down the high street, if you think about all of the takeaway cups that are being used from all of the coffee shops on that high street as one example, and if you collected all of those up over a week and then put them in a pile in the middle of the street, are people really going to look at that as small businesses and go, oh well, I'm only a small part of that, it doesn't matter to me? If you make it at that community level and you start making it really visible and tangible, okay, all those coffee cups might not be a huge amount of carbon emissions, but it certainly highlights the fact that it's not the case, as Ian says, that just because you're small, you can't make a difference.
Yeah, and it links back to James's point earlier about sort of waste being very visible, so something businesses want to get involved in. Sarah, have you got your hand up there? Is that correct? It's a slightly new platform for me.
No, that's fine. I wanted to let the conversation play out there on that subject, because I was actually jumping in from an earlier point when we were talking about the Flex and standards and what we do as the standards body. We set up a community hub that ran alongside the Flex development, and I just wanted to remind people on the call, on the webinar, that is available for people to log into as a resource. It is focused on standards in this area and on standards that one can use, but also it's focused on the Flex, but also on how people can answer each other's questions as well. We've got a couple of blogs on there. We're intending to sort of make sure that we provide more information. It's a community for people to join and share information about how they're doing on planning, in this space as well. So I just wanted to note that as another resource that we provide freely. So that's
fantastic. Thank you. We should share that link. I think we can share it in the follow-up notes. I think we're just about getting there for time. Probably one sort of easy last question. Chloe, you in your presentation, you talked about the current geopolitical climate, which obviously is going to have a sort of very important impact on what we're doing here. Anyone can guess, or no one can guess what the next steps are from the US administration at the moment. It sort of keeps everyone sort of on their toes. Do you think there is an impact, and do you think there's anything that we should consider there as a last sort of easy question to finish up on there?
I think well, I have a small hope that the insurance industry is actually going to be a bit of a catalyst in all of this, because the insurers are increasingly doing the maths and realizing that businesses are quite difficult to insure if they're vulnerable to climate risk. And so I think insurers, whether or not regulation pushes businesses to make themselves less impactful on the environment and less impacted by the environment, then that could do something, because without insurance, you don't have business, and without business, you don't have tax. And not to be too dramatic, without tax, you don't have government or society. So I think the insurers will be, and this could apply to small businesses as well, is your insurance policies might start going up if you're vulnerable to climate. So what's your part in all of that? I think could be something that's quite interesting. Obviously, there'll be not even, but those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I was in the US advising a state on the implementation of nature-based solutions. And what was really interesting to see is that they packaged the climate agenda under a lot of the stuff that they have to do. So they look more at resilience and economic growth, even though it was still sort of the climate agenda. And when I was in Florida, they had a chief resilience officer because of all the sort of natural disasters that are currently hitting them. So, they're addressing climate change. They're looking to work with nature to address some of the issues they have. But, it's less packaged under the sustainability agenda and more under a resilience growth agenda. So that seems
it's the other side of the same coin, I think, mitigation and adaptation. And as climate change continues to happen, thankfully, we're really starting to see people who, nobody really denies climate change anymore.
Yes.
They just have different views on what to do about it.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
that debate seems to be over. Okay, well, I think we're sort of up for time. I don't know if anyone had any sort of last thoughts. Don't worry if not. I just want to make sure that I don't sort of close it down prematurely. No? Okay, well, I think for me that was a great session. So I want to sort of wrap up there. I want to thank you, the sort of speakers, for a very informal and informed session today. Chloe, Adam, Ian, Sarah, and James, thank you very much. I want to thank you, the audience, as well, for participating today. Probably a few sort of minor reminders. We'll send out an email. A few reminders to say, actually, membership, what do you get from your membership? We have 50% off any non-free standards and subscriptions. We have a bank of experts and researchers that can help you with your standards questions. You will also get a membership badge and certificate to help you stand out from your competition. And you get a vote as part of your membership on our AGM, which is coming up on the 21st of May. We will send out slides and a post-event survey. And we will also send out a link to our new net zero barometer. So again, thank you very much, speakers, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. I look forward to concluding now. Thank you very much.